The world of Richard Blackwood was a meticulously arranged tapestry of cold marble polished mahogany, and an emptiness so profound it hummed in the silent spaces between his words. His Fifth Avenue penthouse, a monument to wealth and power, was bathed in the late afternoon sun, which slanted through floor-to-ceiling windows and illuminated a fine layer of dust on a priceless antique table. He stood by the window, a man of 50, with a face carved from disappointment and ambition, watching the endless stream of yellow cabs below, as if they were insignificant insects on a vast, indifferent grid. He was a man who had built his empire on the bedrock of logic and numbers, a fortress of reason that left no room for the unpredictable, the illogical, or the emotionally complex. And nothing in his life had proven more emotionally complex, more stubbornly illogical than his daughter Isabella. Isabella was 6 years old, a wisp of a child with eyes the color of a summer sky, and a silence as vast and impenetrable as the ocean floor. At 3, she had been diagnosed with selective mutism, a condition the specialist described with a clinical detachment that matched Richard's own. To him, Isabella was a data point, a problem to be solved with the right amount of money and the most expensive experts. He had spent fortunes on therapists, child psychologists, and developmental specialists, each promising a breakthrough that never came. They had treated Isabella like a lab rat in a gilded cage, subjecting her to a battery of tests, questionnaires, and play sessions, all designed to unlock the words she stubbornly held captive. But words they never did. The specialists had eventually delivered their final crushing verdict: Isabella may never speak again. Richard had taken the news with the quiet resignation of a man who had already failed and who now only sought a way to manage the failure gracefully. Isabella was not a broken child to be loved and comforted. She was a social embarrassment, a living testament to a flaw in his otherwise perfect life, something to be hidden from the discerning eyes of high society. His approach to fatherhood had since then been one of strategic absence. He provided everything money could buy: a full staff of discreet servants, a private chef, and a rotating roster of nannies from the most prestigious agencies. He spoke to her in hushed, formal tones, rarely touching her as if she were a fragile porcelain doll that might shatter under his clumsy hands. He would ask her a question, wait for the inevitable silence, and then sigh with a quiet, practiced sadness that was more about his own disappointment than her inability to respond. He had taught himself to view her as a project, not a person, a puzzle box with a missing key. The emotional distance was a shield, a way to protect himself from a wound that he had come to believe was permanent. Into this world of sterile perfection and emotional isolation, Keisha Johnson had arrived. Keisha was the antithesis of everything Richard believed in. She was not a product of a prestigious agency, but a referral from one of his lawyers who had a personal connection to a social worker. She was 28, with skin the color of rich earth, and eyes that held a depth of compassion he couldn't begin to fathom. When Richard had interviewed her in his office, she had not been intimidated by his cold demeanor or the opulent surroundings. She had sat across from him with a quiet confidence, her gaze direct and unyielding. "I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "Children aren't problems to be fixed. They are people to be understood." He had hired her out of desperation, a last resort, mostly because her salary demands were a fraction of the agencies he had given up on. He had expected her to fail to resign in a matter of weeks like all the others. He had expected her to treat Isabella with the clinical detachment of a professional, to continue the endless, pointless therapies. He had not expected her to simply listen. But that was exactly what Keisha did. She did not try to force Isabella to talk. She did not bring in flashcards or communication games. She simply sat with her in the hushed, cavernous rooms, and she spoke. She would tell Isabella stories about her childhood in Brooklyn, about the vibrant murals on the walls and the music that poured from every open window. She would bring in books from the local library with illustrations of magical forests and fantastical creatures, and she would read to Isabella in a voice that was full of genuine emotion, not the practiced cheer of a hired hand. Isabella, who had always seemed so withdrawn, would sit in Keisha's lap, her tiny body slowly, tentatively relaxing. Keisha had discovered that Isabella communicated through other means: a glance, a squeeze of a hand, a small subtle tilt of the head. She had begun to learn the unspoken language of the child, a silent code of affection and understanding. And then one day Keisha had brought in a portable keyboard. Richard had discovered it weeks later in the corner of Isabella's nursery, a small, unassuming black box amidst the expensive, unopened toys. He had assumed it was another failed attempt at therapy, another tool for a technician to apply to his mute daughter. He had not thought of it again, too busy with board meetings and social obligations. He had not imagined that this simple keyboard, a cheap plastic thing, would be the instrument of his world's unraveling. On this particular evening, a cold sense of dread had settled in Richard's stomach. A major deal had fallen through. A business rival had outmaneuvered him, and the carefully constructed walls of his professional life were beginning to show hairline cracks. He had left his office early, choosing to retreat to the sanctuary of his home, a place he usually only returned to after the city had gone to sleep. He had expected the usual silence, the hushed, respectful solitude he had become accustomed to. But as he approached Isabella's nursery, he heard it. A sound that was so impossible, so alien to his reality, that he thought for a moment he had lost his mind. It was the soft, lilting sound of a piano, a simple, sweet melody that danced in the air like a fleeting butterfly. It was not a complex composition, but a gentle, comforting tune, the kind of song a mother might sing to her child. And then he heard a voice. It was a voice he had never heard before, not in this house, not from this child. It was a voice as clear as a bell, singing in a language he only vaguely recognized as French. He stopped dead in the hallway, his hand frozen on the doorknob. He had spent 6 years and a king's ransom on a mute daughter, a child who had never uttered a word in his presence, and now here she was singing. He pushed the door open, a soundless motion, and stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home. The scene before him was one of an intimacy he had always considered impossible. Isabella stood at the keyboard, her small, slender fingers moving across the keys with a practiced grace. Her back was to him, her blue eyes fixed on Keisha, who sat on a small stool, her own hands flying over the keys of the portable keyboard. Keisha was not looking at the notes, but at Isabella, a soft, encouraging smile on her face. And Isabella was not just singing. She was singing with an uninhibited joy that shook Richard to his core. The words flowed from her, a cascade of perfect French, each syllable a tiny miracle. L'amour est un oiseau rebelle, Isabella sang, her voice pure and true, a note of triumph in a world of silence. Keisha's voice, a warm, resonant alto, joined in harmony, que nul ne peut apprivoiser. The song, a lullaby of love and wildness, seemed to fill the room, pushing back against the sterile opulence that defined Richard's life. He stood there, a witness to a secret world, a world he had been locked out of for so long. The girl he had written off as a lost cause was a hidden prodigy. The woman he had hired for her low salary was a master of a craft he couldn't comprehend. The fortress of his beliefs, his carefully constructed reality, began to tremble. He watched, horrified and mesmerized, as Isabella finished the final notes. She turned her face a mask of pure, unadulterated happiness. Her eyes filled with the light of a secret shared fell on him. The smile vanished. The melody died. The silence, a silence more profound and terrible than any he had ever known, returned. It was a silence that was no longer an inability, but a choice. He felt the rage build in his chest, a hot, uncontrollable fire. It was not the rage of a father who had been lied to. It was the rage of a man who had been made to look like a fool. He had spent a fortune on experts who had promised him results and failed. And this woman who he had considered a last desperate option, had succeeded in 2 months with a simple keyboard and a song. He stepped into the room, the sound of his expensive shoes on the hardwood floor shattering the remaining stillness. The anger was a roaring beast in his throat. "What the hell is going on here?" He thundered, the words echoing off the walls. Both Keisha and Isabella jumped. Isabella, her face a mask of terror, immediately fell silent, her eyes once filled with light, now wide with fear. She scurried behind Keisha, her small hands clutching at the fabric of the nanny's simple black dress. Keisha, with a calmness that only fueled Richard's fury, rose from the stool and placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain," she said, her voice even and collected. "Explain," Richard roared, storming further into the room. "Explain how you, a nanny with no medical training, cured my daughter when the best specialists in New York said she might never speak again. Explain how you made her talk when all my money and all my resources failed." He looked at Keisha, really looked at her, and saw in her expression not fear, but a quiet, formidable strength. He had always seen her as an employee, a disposable part of the machine. Now he saw an adversary, a woman who held a power he could not buy, and in her eyes he saw a truth that he was not ready to confront. The truth that the doctors had been right about one thing: his daughter was not mute. She just didn't want to talk to him. The air in the nursery crackled with a tension that was far more powerful than the opulence of the room. Richard Blackwood stood over Kesha and Isabella, his face a mask of furious disbelief. He had spent years and millions on experts who had promised a cure for his daughter's silence, and here in his own home, a nanny had achieved it with a simple song. The irony was a bitter pill he could not swallow. He saw Kesha's calm, her unwavering gaze, and it only fueled his rage. To him, she was not a healer, but a manipulator who had dared to challenge his authority and his carefully constructed reality. "I want an explanation," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The doctors, the specialists, they all said it was a serious neurological disorder. And you, a nanny I hired for a fraction of their fee, you suddenly have the cure. It is impossible. Kesha met his gaze without flinching. She could see the fear beneath his fury, the fear of a man whose control was slipping away. She placed her hand on Isabella's shoulder, a silent promise of protection. "I didn't cure her, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a soothing balm in the chaotic room. "Isabella has always been able to speak. She just hasn't chosen to. She chooses." Richard's laugh was a harsh, scornful sound. "She's 6 years old. She hasn't spoken to me in over 2 years. She's practically mute. You call that a choice?" The medical reports are clear, Miss Johnson, about her limitations. Her profound limitations. The word just echoed in his voice, a casual cruelty that dismissed everything Kesha was. He saw her as nothing more than an employee, a minor player in a game he controlled. Kesha's eyes darkened with a quiet fire. She felt Isabella's small hand squeeze hers, a signal of distress. "I didn't fill her head with impossibilities, sir. I simply listened to her. Isabella tells me incredible stories every day. She knows 3 languages she plays, 4 different instruments, she writes beautiful poems. The reports you have, they only reflect the child you showed them, the child who was afraid to speak. Lies." Richard spat out the word as if it were a physical thing. "You've manipulated her, filled her head with fantasies to make yourself seem indispensable." The contempt in his voice was a palpable force, a wall of prejudice he had built around himself. He would not accept that a black nanny, a woman he had hired out of desperation, could possess a talent that his millions could not buy. His ego, his carefully cultivated image of a man who was always in control, could not handle the blow. He looked at Isabella, who was clinging to Kesha, and his face hardened. To him, she was a co-conspirator, a disobedient project who had turned against him. It was then that Isabella did something neither adult expected. She stepped out from behind Kesha, her small body trembling, and looked directly at her father. Her eyes, filled with a sorrow and wisdom that belied her age, held his gaze. She had been silent for so long, a ghost in her own home. Now she was an immovable force. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense air like a shard of glass. "I talk." Richard stumbled back, his face turning pale. He felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The voice, his daughter's voice, was not the voice of a confused child, but the voice of a knowing, mature soul. The years of silence had been a barrier. She had built a fortress of her own making, and he had been a prisoner outside its walls. "That's impossible," he muttered, his mind struggling to reconcile the girl he saw before him with the child he had hidden away for so long. The doctors, the tests, years of therapy. Isabella's voice grew stronger, each word a devastating truth. "Kesha asked me what I think. You only ask the doctors, what's wrong with me?" The devastating simplicity of that sentence hit Richard like a slap in the face. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a broken child, but an intelligent, self-aware girl who had been silenced by a world that preferred to label her rather than understand her. He saw the truth of his own actions, his cold indifference, his lack of genuine affection. He had spent a fortune on doctors who diagnosed her, but he had never spent a single moment trying to connect with her, to simply be a father. But Richard Blackwood was not the kind of man who admitted he was wrong. especially not in front of an employee he considered inferior. He had always believed that to admit a flaw was to expose a weakness, and weakness was a luxury he could not afford. His expression hardened again, the familiar mask of arrogance returning. "Kesha, you're fired." He said the words a cold dismissal that carried the weight of finality. "I want you out of my house right now." "No!" Isabella screamed a sound that tore at the heart. She lunged forward, clinging to Kesha's dress, her body shaking with sobs. "She can't leave. She's the only one who understands me." Richard completely ignored his daughter's despair. He saw her pleas not as a sign of her love for Kesha, but as proof of Kesha's manipulative nature. He had a narrative in his head, a convenient truth that absolved him of all blame, and he would cling to it at all costs. "You've manipulated my daughter somehow," he said, his eyes fixed on Kesha. "I don't know what tricks you've used, but this is enough." Kesha remained calm, even as she watched Isabella begin to cry silently, her small body racked with sobs. There was a quiet dignity to her that infuriated Richard. She was not begging, she was not pleading. She was simply observing, her eyes holding a determined gaze that made him hesitate for a second, as if she knew something he didn't. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood," Kesha said softly. "But before I go, Isabella has something to show you. Something that might change your perspective on your own daughter." Richard pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over a number. He was a man of action, of swift, decisive moves. He had no time for theatrics. "You have 15 minutes to gather your things and get off my property," he declared. "And if you try to contact my daughter again, I'll call my lawyers." He began to dial a number, probably for the private security agency that looked after the mansion. Richard Blackwood was exactly the kind of person Kesha had learned to recognize after years of working for Manhattan's elite families, rich enough to buy anything except the ability to see his own daughter as a complete human being. He was a man who had confused money with intelligence, power with wisdom. "Mr. Blackwood," Kesha said calmly, even though she could see Isabella still clinging to her dress, her small body racked with silent sobs. "Can I at least explain what I've discovered about Isabella over the last 2 months?" "There's nothing to discover," Richard cut her off, hanging up the phone. "My daughter has clear limitations diagnosed by competent professionals. You're not a doctor. You're not a therapist. You're just a nanny who managed to teach a few tricks to a confused child." The word just echoed through the room like a slap, a cold and vicious sound. He was a man who saw the world in hierarchies, and in his world, Kesha Johnson was at the very bottom. He did not know that Kesha Johnson had graduated from Columbia University with honors in child psychology, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had specializations in cognitive development and childhood trauma. To him, she would always be just a black nanny, hired for her low salary. "Daddy, please!" Isabella begged, her first words to her father in over 2 years. "Kesha taught me that I'm smart. She teaches me things the doctors never did." Richard didn't even look at his daughter. His eyes remained fixed on Kesha with a coldness she knew all too well, the look of someone accustomed to discarding people like disposable objects. "Isabella, go to your room," he ordered, his voice flat and emotionless, as if he were talking to a disobedient dog. "The new nanny will arrive tomorrow morning." "I don't want a new nanny!" Isabella screamed, clutching Kesha's dress even tighter. "I want Kesha. She doesn't treat me like I'm broken." It was then that Richard did something that shocked even Kesha. He picked Isabella up with excessive force, completely ignoring her screams and pleas, and handed her to Carmen, the housekeeper who had appeared at the door. "Carmen, take Isabella to her room and lock the door," he said, his voice as cold and detached as if he were giving instructions about the trash. "She doesn't come out until I've sorted this out." "Kesha," Isabella yelled as she was dragged out of the room, her tears echoing down the hallway. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." The sound of Isabella's bedroom door locking cut through the air like a gunshot. Kesha stood motionless, processing the utter coldness of this man who had just traumatized his own daughter to maintain his convenient version of reality. Now Richard turned to Kesha with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have 10 minutes. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll call security." Kesha Johnson had grown up in Brooklyn, the daughter of a cleaning lady and a bus driver. She knew intimately the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, and treated as inferior by people who confused money with intelligence. But she had also learned something that Richard Blackwood had yet to discover. The most dangerous people are those you completely underestimate. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even as she gathered her purse. "Can I ask you a simple question?" Richard glanced at the gold Rolex on his wrist with theatrical impatience. "Quick. Do you really believe your daughter is incapable, or are you afraid to find out that she's smarter than you think?" The question hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. He took a step toward Kesha, his fists clenched. "How dare you question my ability as a father? I've spent a fortune on experts' therapies, treatments. I've done everything for my daughter. Everything except—" "Listen to her," Kesha replied softly. "Isabella doesn't need more therapists, sir. She needs a father who believes in her." Richard laughed scornfully. "Parenting advice from a babysitter in her 20s who doesn't even have children. What a joke." Kesha opened her purse and took out a small, unassuming digital recorder. She held it in her hand, the black plastic a stark contrast to the opulence of the room. "Mr. Blackwood, over the past 2 months, Isabella has told me many things. Stories about how she feels when the doctors talk about her as if she isn't there. How sad she gets when you cancel dinner parties because you're ashamed to take her out. How she pretended she couldn't walk properly during a doctor's appointment because she realized that the more limited she appeared, the more attention she got." Richard's face gradually paled as Kesha spoke. He remembered the phone calls, the distant conversations where he had dismissed his daughter as an inconvenience. He had always assumed he was alone. "Your daughter is not mute, Mr. Blackwood. She is a brilliant child who has learned that silence is the only way to get affection in a home where being different is treated like a disease." Richard violently snatched the tape recorder from Kesha's hands. "You weren't allowed to record anything in this house. This is invasion of privacy. Isabella gave me permission," Kesha replied calmly. "She wanted someone to finally hear her voice. And there are many more recordings, sir. 2 hours of conversations where your daughter demonstrates an advanced vocabulary knowledge of classical music and an emotional understanding that would impress any psychologist." Reality began to form in Richard's eyes like a distant storm. For the first time, he understood that he had completely underestimated not only his daughter, but also the woman standing in front of him. Kesha smiled for the first time since Richard had entered the room. It wasn't a smile of victory, but something much more dangerous, the expression of someone who possessed information that could destroy a carefully constructed world. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I want you to stop treating your daughter like a failed project and start seeing her as the extraordinary child she has always been. But more than that," she paused, pulling another recorder from her sleeve. "I want you to understand that some people you consider just employees know exactly how to document inconvenient truths." From the hallway, Isabella could still be heard crying in her locked bedroom, calling Kesha's name. The sound cut through the tense air between the two adults like a constant reminder that at the center of this battle of wills was a 6-year-old child who just wanted to be understood. Richard looked at Kesha with a mixture of anger and something she recognized as fear. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who was not intimidated by his money, his social status, or his threats. Someone who possessed something he could not buy: the truth about who he really was as a father. The sound of the front door closing was a hollow, definitive sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the grand foyer. It marked the final silent departure of Kesha Johnson from the Blackwood mansion, leaving behind an absence as palpable as her presence had been. Richard stood motionless for a full minute, the stolen recorder clutched in his hand. He felt no sense of victory, only a disquieting emptiness, as if he had won a battle he had not intended to fight, and in the process lost something he hadn't known was worth keeping. The silence in the house, once his preferred state of being, now felt heavy and accusatory, a physical weight pressing down on him. He looked at the housekeeper, Carmen, who stood in the hallway, her face a mixture of worry and defiance. "Isabella is to remain in her room until I tell you otherwise," he said, his voice flat and final, trying to reassert the control that had so recently felt like it was slipping from his grasp. Carmen simply nodded, her eyes avoiding his, and disappeared down the hallway toward the locked bedroom. The faint sound of Isabella's muffled sobs, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the house's cold perfection, was a constant haunting reminder of the chaos he had unleashed. Richard retreated to his office, a sanctuary of leather and cold steel, and poured himself a glass of amber liquid. The warmth did little to soothe the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. He sat behind his large, imposing desk and stared at the digital recorder. He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to smash it against the wall, to destroy the tiny black box that held the uncomfortable truths of his life. But he didn't. Instead, he placed it carefully in a drawer and locked it. Out of sight, out of mind, he told himself. A convenient lie that he was an expert at telling himself. The next morning, the new nanny arrived. Margaret Foster was a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a posture that spoke of decades of professional discipline. She had been sent by the most expensive agency in Manhattan, a woman with a resume that included caring for the children of European royalty and American billionaires. She was the very definition of professional discretion, a perfect fit for the Blackwood household. "I have read the file on Isabella," Margaret said to Richard, her voice a calm, clipped English accent. "It is a challenging case, to be sure. But I have dealt with similar situations. I believe a structured routine and firm boundaries are what she needs. Children require consistency." Richard nodded, his relief a tangible thing. This was a world he understood. Structure, routine, boundaries. This was a language he spoke. He didn't need a nanny who listened to songs and played games. He needed a professional who would restore order, who would put the puzzle back together with a clean, clinical precision. He watched as Margaret, a woman who looked more like a headmistress than a caregiver, was escorted to Isabella's room. He felt a sense of finality. The problem was solved. But the problem, he was beginning to realize, was not Isabella. The problem was the vacuum Kesha had left behind. 3 days passed. The house was once again silent. Isabella, true to her nature, had completely retreated. She refused to speak. She refused to eat. And she refused to leave her room. She did not throw tantrums or make a scene. She simply existed in a state of quiet, profound resistance. She would sit on her bed, her small body curled up in a ball, staring at the wall with an expression of distant sorrow. Margaret, for all her experience and impeccable credentials, was at a loss. She tried all the conventional methods. She would read to Isabella from classic children's stories, but the words seemed to bounce off the walls of the child's silent fortress. She would offer her games, puzzles, and art supplies, but Isabella would not touch them. She would sit beside her in quiet contemplation, waiting for a sign, any sign of a breakthrough. But there were none. Isabella's silence was no longer a symptom of a neurological disorder. It was an act of protest, a deliberate refusal to engage with a world that had so cruelly taken away the one person who had truly seen her. Carmen, the housekeeper, began to worry. She would find Richard in his office, her face etched with concern. "Sir, Isabella hasn't eaten properly in 3 days. She's getting thinner. She just sits there." Richard would wave her away, his eyes fixed on his financial reports. "That's natural, Carmen. She's adjusting to the new routine. Miss Foster is a qualified professional. This is her normal behavior." But Margaret Foster, an experienced professional, knew better. In 4 decades of caring for children, she had never seen a child so completely shut down. The clinical files had described Isabella's condition as one of profound limitations. But Margaret saw something else. A child who possessed an emotional depth and a mental strength that was far from limited. She saw the drawings Isabella had scribbled on a notepad before her arrival, drawings of a little girl with a bird singing on her shoulder, an image of an imprisoned soul finally finding its voice. And she saw the desperation in Isabella's eyes when she thought no one was looking. One night, after Richard had retired to his office, Margaret decided to break protocol. She sat on the floor of Isabella's room, a few feet away from the bed where the child was curled up. She did not bring a book or a game. She simply sat, and she spoke not as a professional, but as a person. "I know you can hear me, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice a gentle murmur in the silent room. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I know this must be very confusing and very sad for you. But I would really truly like to get to know you better, to understand you." For a full minute, Isabella did not move. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she looked up. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, met Margaret's. They were not the blank, vacant eyes of a child with a profound neurological disorder. They were the eyes of a child who was grieving. She slid off the bed and walked over to a small desk. She picked up a notepad and a pen, and in surprisingly mature and elegant handwriting, she wrote a single sentence. "Is Kesha coming back?" Margaret looked at the words and felt a wave of profound sorrow. This was not a child with a cognitive disability. This was a desperately lonely little girl whose heart had been broken. Margaret looked at the words on the notepad, a a silent question that cut through the years of silence. She looked at Isabella, who was now staring at her with an intensity that demanded an honest answer. "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice filled with a genuine sadness. "I truly don't. But I do know that you are a brave and special little girl. You are much more special than anyone in this house realizes." Isabella's face softened. A flicker of something, a fleeting half-smile crossed her lips. It was a sad smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. She took the notepad again and wrote another sentence. Kesha knew that. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She tried to process the emotional complexity of the 6-year-old before her. A child who was not only intelligent and self-aware, but also possessed a keen, almost painful understanding of the people in her life. She was a child who had learned to communicate through silence, through subtle actions, and through the power of her own will. And she was a child who was waiting for the one person who had truly understood her to return. As Margaret tried to process this information, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. She looked at it confused and saw a name she had only ever seen in Isabella's file, Kesha Johnson. The message read, "Hello, Margaret. I'm Kesha Johnson, Isabella's previous nanny. I know you're a serious professional and that you must be noticing strange things in the family dynamic. If you want to talk about what's really going on in this house, please reach out to me. Isabella needs our help." Margaret looked at Isabella, who had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching the notepad with her question about Kesha. For the first time in her career, Margaret Foster, an experienced and highly respected professional, found herself questioning whether being in this home was more harmful than beneficial to a child. And she found herself wondering just what kind of storm she had been hired to quell, and whether she should in fact be aiding it. Across town, in a small apartment she shared with 2 fellow graduate students, Kesha sat surrounded by files, recordings, and photographs. She was meticulously organizing what she had begun to call Project Isabella, a complete documentation that would prove not only the girl's genius, but the systematic neglect she had suffered at the hands of her father. Her lawyer, David Martinez, had made it clear that they had a solid legal case, but Kesha wanted something more satisfying than a court victory. She wanted Richard Blackwood to publicly acknowledge the extraordinary daughter he had ignored for years, because some men only learn when they lose everything they thought they had. And Richard was about to discover that he had underestimated not just a competent nanny, but a woman who would turn every act of contempt into fuel for a justice that would completely reshape Isabella's future. The world Kesha Johnson inhabited was a universe away from the gilded cage of the Blackwood mansion. Her apartment, a cramped space in a brownstone building in Brooklyn, was filled not with museum-quality art and polished marble, but with towering stacks of books on child development psychology journals and legal texts on children's rights. The only luxury she allowed herself was a worn, comfortable armchair by the window where she could watch the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the city below. The same city that had forged her a place that taught you early on that the only way to get ahead was to be smarter, to work harder, and to never ever underestimate those who dismissed you. Kesha's personal history was a testament to this truth. She was the daughter of a cleaning lady and a bus driver, 2 people who had sacrificed everything to give their child an education they could only dream of. From an early age, Kesha had learned to navigate the subtle, unspoken prejudices of a society that judged her by the color of her skin and the address of her childhood home. She had been called articulate, as if it were a surprise, bright for her background, as if her intellect were an anomaly. But instead of letting these casual cruelties break her, she had used them as fuel. She had not only graduated at the top of her class from Columbia University with a degree in child psychology, but she had also pursued a master's degree in children's rights at New York University, driven by a fierce, unyielding need to be a voice for those who were not being heard. She was not just a nanny. She was a scholar, a researcher, and an advocate. And Isabella Blackwood was to Kesha's academic mind a textbook case. After leaving the Blackwood mansion, Kesha had retreated to her apartment and began to systematically organize the documentation she had meticulously gathered over the past 2 months. She had not done so out of malice or a plan for revenge. She had done it out of academic habit. For her, Isabella was not just a child in her care. She was an exceptional case study, a child with an advanced mind who had developed a sophisticated coping mechanism, selective mutism, to deal with systematic emotional neglect. She had filled notebooks with her observations, logging every interaction, every nonverbal cue, every subtle shift in Isabella's mood. She had documented the child's drawings, her musical compositions, the short poems she had scribbled on napkins. The recordings on the digital recorders were not a secret weapon for blackmail, but raw data for a thesis, a living case file that would become the foundation of her doctoral dissertation. Kesha had always known that Isabella was a gifted child, and she had seen with a clinical eye how the child's intelligence was being systematically masked by the very man who was supposed to be her protector. Her mentor, Dr. Sarah Chun, a renowned professor of child psychology at Columbia, had been a key ally. Kesha had gone to her immediately armed with the first set of recordings and her detailed notes. Dr. Chun, a woman of sharp intellect and little patience for social niceties, had been both horrified and fascinated. "Kesha, this is extraordinary." Dr. Chun had said, her voice filled with a scholarly outrage as she listened to Isabella singing an entire opera in Italian. The child not only possesses superior intelligence, but has developed a highly sophisticated coping mechanism to deal with systematic emotional neglect. She is literally protecting her own mental health through selective mutism. This is a perfect example of how family biases can mask giftedness. The father's expectation of a limited child is being reinforced by professionals who are simply giving him the answers he wants to hear. He is causing irreversible psychological damage. Kesha had nodded, her face grim. He thinks he's healing her with therapists who treat her like she's mentally disabled. He sees her as a problem to be fixed, not as a gift to be cherished. Dr. Chun had been eager to present the case at the upcoming Child Development Conference. But Kesha, with her deep understanding of the human element, had cautioned her to wait. "Not yet," she had said. "First, Richard Blackwood needs to understand that his daughter is not a problem to be hidden away. She is a gift that he is wasting. The court of public opinion is one thing, but the truth hitting him in his own home is another." Now, 3 days after leaving the Blackwood mansion, Kesha was at the law offices of Martinez and Associates, a firm known for its work in family law and children's rights. She sat across from David Martinez, a man with a tired face and the compassionate eyes of someone who had seen too much injustice. She had presented him with the first part of her documentation, the recordings, the psychological reports she had secretly acquired, the photographs of Isabella's artistic and musical creations. Martinez had listened patiently, his face a mask of professional calm. When Kesha finished, he leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped over his stomach. "Miss Johnson, the documentation you have provided is comprehensive and compelling. You have a very strong case for child welfare neglect and systematic emotional abuse." Kesha's heart hammered in her chest. This was it, the first step in a long, difficult battle. "I don't want a settlement, Mr. Martinez. I don't want money." Martinez looked at her, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "Then what do you want?" "I want a legal framework that will force Richard Blackwood to acknowledge his daughter's intelligence. I want him to stop treating her as a liability and start treating her as an extraordinary child. I want to ensure she receives the education and emotional support she needs to thrive. I want a court order for a new psychological evaluation by an unbiased professional. And I want to ensure that her education is monitored by me." Martinez was silent for a moment, absorbing the request. Most clients who came to him wanted money revenge or a quick resolution. Kesha wanted something else entirely. She wanted justice not for herself, but for a child she barely knew. "This is a different kind of fight, Miss Johnson. He has immense resources. He will try to bury you in litigation. He will question your character, your motives, your mental health. He will use your race, your background, everything he can to discredit you." Kesha met his gaze without hesitation. "I know. I'm used to it. My entire life has been a fight against prejudice. What this privileged man doesn't know is that every act of contempt is providing me with exactly the ammunition I need for a war he doesn't even realize he's losing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming black device. It was her third digital recorder. "He thinks he confiscated everything, but I always keep a backup. He thinks he won the moment he fired me. He doesn't know that the greatest strength grows at the very moment others believe they have broken our spirit. He is about to learn that the simple nanny he despised is a woman who has documented every step of her life to prove a point. A point he is about to become a living example of." Kesha stood, her resolve as solid as a mountain. She was no longer just an advocate for Isabella. She was an instrument of change, a force of nature that had been underestimated for too long. She had been given an opportunity to not only help a child, but to prove a much larger point about privilege, prejudice, and the invisible battles fought every day by those society deemed less than. I have a feeling, Martinez said, a faint smile on his face, that this is going to be a very interesting case. Just as she was about to leave, her phone vibrated with a text message. It was Margaret Foster. The message was simple. A single question. What should I do? Kesha felt a jolt of exhilaration. She was no longer fighting alone. She was about to build an army of truth against a fortress of lies. And the first soldier had just enlisted. Margaret Foster was a creature of routine and a steadfast believer in the unshakable truth of professional decorum. Her 40-year career had been built on a foundation of strict boundaries, quiet competence, and an unwavering loyalty to her employers. She had worked for the children of presidents and titans of industry, and she had seen it all: the subtle cruelties, the casual neglect, the apathetic parents who viewed their offspring as assets to be managed. But she had always maintained her professional distance, believing that her role was to care for the child, within the established parameters, not to judge the world they lived in. The text message from Kesha Johnson, a name she had only ever seen in Isabella's file, was a profound disruption to her carefully ordered world. It was a direct invitation to break every rule she had lived by. Margaret looked at the phone in her hand, the simple black device feeling suddenly like a ticking time bomb. Isabella, who had drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, still clutched the notepad with her silent question about Kesha. The image was a powerful counterpoint to Richard Blackwood's cold indifference, a stark illustration of the emotional chasm in this family. Margaret went to her room, a space of quiet solitude, and reread the message. If you want to talk about what's really going on in this house, please reach out to me. Isabella needs our help. The message was not a threat or an act of malice. It was an appeal, a genuine plea from one professional to another. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Her professional instincts told her to ignore the message, to dismiss Kesha as a disgruntled former employee with a grievance. But her human instincts, the maternal sense she had honed over a lifetime of caring for children, told her something else entirely. It told her that this child, Isabella, was in a profound state of emotional distress, and that the official narrative, the one Richard Blackwood had so carefully constructed, was a lie. She thought about the conversation she had with Richard. His cold dismissal of Isabella's talents, his insistence on the clear limitations of his daughter. She had seen the genuine pain in Isabella's eyes, the deep-seated sorrow that no amount of professional distance could mask. Margaret had a file full of glowing recommendations, a reputation built on trust and discretion. To reach out to Kesha would be a betrayal of that trust. It would be an admission that she, Margaret Foster, the unflappable professional, was in over her head. But then she looked at the notepad on her nightstand, a small piece of paper with a question scrawled in a child's surprisingly mature hand. Is Kesha coming back? The question was a silent scream for help, a plea for the one person who had truly seen her. Margaret had promised her decades of experience to Richard, but her loyalty was to the child, not the paycheck. She had been hired to care for Isabella, and caring for Isabella, she realized, meant doing what was right for her, not what was easy or convenient for her father. Late that night, after the mansion had fallen into its usual oppressive silence, Margaret walked to the master bathroom, a place with a thick, soundproof door and a complete sense of privacy. She locked the door, pulled out her phone, and with a trembling hand, she dialed the number Kesha had texted her from. Kesha answered on the first ring, her voice low and calm. "Margaret, I knew you'd call." You don't know that, Margaret said, her voice a hushed whisper, a nervous energy bubbling beneath her clipped accent. You don't know anything about me. My professional ethics are... You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Kesha replied, her voice filled with a quiet empathy. I understand that you saw a child in pain. I understand that you saw a girl who was not just a medical case, but a human being with a broken heart. You've been in that house for 3 days, Margaret. You've seen it with your own eyes. Richard Blackwood is not just a bad father. He is a man who is actively harming his daughter because he refuses to acknowledge a reality that challenges his own sense of self-worth. Margaret was silent for a moment, the truth of Kesha's words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She thought of Richard, so quick to dismiss his daughter, so quick to fire the one person who had made her happy. She thought of Isabella so withdrawn, so utterly silent in her protest. What is it you want from me? I don't want you to take sides, Keisha said. I want you to be a witness, to document what you see. The moments of silence, the acts of resistance, the subtle shifts in Isabella's demeanor. I need you to confirm what I already know, that Isabella's mutism is a coping mechanism, not a disability, that it is a direct result of her father's emotional neglect. Margaret, a woman of facts and figures, felt her professional curiosity piqued. She had been a caregiver, a nanny. She had never been a spy. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and completely out of character. But the more Keisha spoke, the more Margaret began to see the logic in her plan. Keisha laid out her strategy with the precision of a lawyer. The meticulous documentation, the legal precedents, the collaboration with Dr. Sarah Chun, a name Margaret knew well and respected. Keisha was not a disgruntled employee. She was a professional who was building a case with a solid legal foundation for the welfare of a child. I cannot be a part of a legal action, Margaret said, her voice firmer now. My reputation, it would be ruined. I would never work again. And what about Isabella's well-being? Keisha countered gently. What is the price of your reputation compared to a child's future? You can do this in your own way. You don't have to break protocol, Margaret. You just have to observe and document. And when the time comes, you can provide an expert testimony that will change everything for this child. Margaret was silent for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the dark, polished faucet. She saw a woman who had always done what was expected of her, who had always followed the rules. But she also saw the faint lines of a moral exhaustion on her face, the quiet toll of years of witnessing children in pain. She knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating that she could not sit by and let this child be harmed. I will do what is necessary, Margaret said, the words a quiet promise, a vow to a silent child. From that moment on, Margaret Foster's role in the Blackwood household changed. She was no longer just the nanny. She was a secret ally, an observer in a high-stakes psychological war. She began to keep her own discreet journal, documenting every interaction with Richard, every moment of Isabella's resistance, every subtle sign of her intellect and emotional depth. She would send Keisha short, cryptic text messages confirming her observations. Keisha, in turn, would send her information about child development, about the psychological effects of emotional neglect, and about the legal precedents she was building. The two women from two different worlds with two different approaches had formed an unlikely alliance. One was a scholar and an activist driven by a fierce sense of justice. The other was a seasoned professional driven by a quiet, unshakable sense of duty. But their goal was the same: to save a child who was being harmed by the very man who was supposed to protect her. The Blackwood mansion, which had seemed so impenetrable, was now a house with two secrets. One was the secret of a child's genius, and the other was the secret of a quiet, relentless force working from within to bring that genius to light. The final silent battle had begun, and Richard Blackwood, who believed he had won, had no idea he was already losing. The fortress of Richard Blackwood's life, built with the cold bricks of ambition and the concrete of control, began to show its first cracks. The process was subtle at first, a whisper of a problem on the distant horizon, but it quickly became a storm. The first tremor came in the form of an unexpected email from a legal associate, a man he had never worked with before. The subject line was curt and formal. Urgent matter regarding Miss Keisha Johnson. Richard, dismissive and preoccupied with a faltering business deal, flagged it for later review and thought nothing more of it. He believed the matter of the impertinent nanny was closed, a minor inconvenience that had been dealt with. 3 days later, the tremors became a full-fledged quake. Richard woke to a series of notifications on his phone that made his blood run cold. The first was an email from the New York Department of Children's Services requesting an urgent family welfare assessment for the Blackwood home. The second was a missed call from his personal lawyer, a man who only ever called for matters of grave importance. The third was a message that would change his life forever. The message came from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart pounding with a sudden irrational fear. It read, "Mr. Blackwood, press conference today at 3:00 p.m. at Columbia University's Children's Rights Center. Your presence is recommended. KJ." The acronym, simple and unassuming, hit him with the force of a physical blow. KJ, Keisha Johnson. The woman he had so contemptuously dismissed, the woman he had underestimated and thrown out of his home, was not just a disgruntled former employee. She was a force of nature, and she was coming for him. Richard rushed to his office, his mind reeling. He had been so convinced that his money and his power were a shield against all threats. He had been so blind in his arrogance. He immediately called his lawyer. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice strained. "Why does social services want to evaluate my home?" His lawyer, a man named Henderson, with a voice that was usually as steady as a rock, was tense and agitated. "Mr. Blackwood, you need to come to my office right now. We have a much more serious situation than we thought. I have just received a preliminary injunction from Martinez and Associates, a firm that specializes in children's rights. They are demanding a full independent psychological reevaluation of your daughter Isabella. They have submitted a preliminary file that is, to be blunt, incredibly damaging." Damaging? Richard's mind reeled. What could a nanny possibly have? "Everything," his lawyer replied. The single word, a testament to the meticulousness of the documentation. "They have transcripts of your phone calls with Isabella's doctors, correspondence with your therapists, and a series of audio and video recordings of your daughter demonstrating what they describe as exceptional cognitive abilities. They claim that you have systematically misrepresented your daughter's condition to justify your own emotional neglect. The injunction is seeking a court-ordered family welfare assessment, and the case file is being presented at a press conference today." The phone slipped from Richard's numb fingers and clattered onto his desk. A press conference. Kesha wasn't just coming for his money. She was coming for his reputation. She was going to air his dirty laundry in public, to expose his failings as a father to the entire world. The idea was a humiliation so profound it made him feel physically ill. He looked at the open file on his computer screen, a business proposal he had been working on for weeks. It felt meaningless now, a hollow pursuit in a world that was suddenly filled with real human consequences. For the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood felt a profound sense of helplessness. His money couldn't buy his way out of this. His power couldn't intimidate a lawyer who was working for a cause, not a paycheck. His carefully constructed facade of a successful, respected man was about to be torn to shreds. He remembered Isabella's voice, clear and strong, telling him that she talked, but she didn't talk to people who didn't want to listen. He remembered the quiet, relentless determination in Kesha's eyes. He had assumed it was anger or vindictiveness. He was beginning to realize it was something far more dangerous, a quiet, unwavering moral certainty. She was not doing this out of spite. She was doing it out of a conviction that he had betrayed his daughter, and she was going to make sure he was held accountable. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below, a vast, indifferent grid. He had always seen himself as a king in this kingdom of steel and glass, a man who was untouchable. Now he felt as small and insignificant as the yellow cabs below. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Margaret Foster, who was working in the adjacent room, noticed the change in him. She saw the way he was pacing, the tense, agitated movements, the way he kept glancing at his phone as if expecting a blow. She had not had to document anything that morning. His distress was a palpable living thing that filled the air. She found him in the kitchen, staring at a half-empty glass of water, his mind a million miles away. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Is everything all right?" Richard jumped, startled. He looked at her, his eyes wild. He was a man who was used to being in control, but now he was losing it. He had always seen Margaret as just another employee, a quiet, efficient cog in his machine. Now he saw a woman with a calm, discerning gaze. A woman who had been a silent witness to his failings for 3 days. "It's nothing," he said, his voice clipped and strained. "Just business." Margaret nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of understanding. She did not pry, she did not judge. She simply went about her work, her quiet competence a stark contrast to his inner turmoil. She knew with a certainty that was both liberating and terrifying that she was no longer just a nanny. She was a key player in a drama that was about to unfold, and her testimony would be the final damning piece of evidence that would bring this man to his knees. Richard, feeling a sudden, overwhelming need to assert some control, walked to Isabella's room. The door was unlocked, a small rebellion against his previous order. He pushed it open and saw Isabella sitting on her bed, her back to him, staring out the window. She had not said a word to him in 3 days. He had expected her to be broken, to be begging for his attention. But her silence was not a sign of defeat. It was a sign of a quiet, unshakable strength. "Isabella," he said, his voice a tight, unfamiliar sound. I know you're upset." She did not respond. She did not even turn. She continued to stare out the window, her tiny body a monument to her unyielding will. Richard felt a profound sense of isolation. He had always defined himself by his success, by his wealth, by the respect he commanded. But in this room, with his own daughter, all of that meant nothing. He was just a man, a father who had failed to connect with the one person who mattered most. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Isabella, I can explain. It's a complicated situation, but I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make everything right." The words felt hollow and meaningless even to him. They were the words of a man who was used to buying his way out of problems, a man who believed that a few well-placed phone calls could erase his past. But they could not erase the sorrow in his daughter's eyes. They could not erase the fact that he had chosen to believe a convenient lie over a difficult truth. Isabella, with a quiet, deliberate movement, turned from the window. She looked at him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of the child he had seen singing with Kesha. But it was quickly replaced by an expression of cold, weary resignation. She picked up a notepad from her bedside table, and with the same elegant, mature handwriting Margaret had seen, she wrote a single sentence. "You can't fix it with money. You can only fix it with listening." She held the notepad out to him. Richard took it, his hand trembling. The words were a slap in the face, a devastating truth from a child he had written off as a lost cause. He had spent his life buying and selling, believing that everything had a price. He was beginning to realize that the most valuable things in life, love, forgiveness, and the trust of his own daughter, were not for sale. The final act of his carefully constructed life was about to begin, and he had no idea what role he was supposed to play. The conference room in Henderson's law office was a place of cold, sterile precision, a universe away from the chaotic emotional world that had consumed Richard Blackwood's life. The room smelled of polished wood and expensive paper, and the air was thick with a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Richard, his face pale and strained, sat across a long table from a man he did not know, a man with a tired face and the quiet, unnerving demeanor of a person who held all the cards. This was David Martinez, Kesha Johnson's lawyer. Beside him sat a severe-looking woman with a scholarly air and eyes that seemed to see right through him. This was Dr. Sarah Chun, Kesha's mentor and an expert in child psychology. Richard had come prepared to fight. He had brought his own lawyer, a man he had paid a fortune to protect his image and his fortune. But as he sat there, he felt a profound sense of helplessness. His usual tactics, his intimidation, his arrogance, his wealth seemed to have no power here. This was not a boardroom. This was a place where truth was a currency, and Kesha Johnson was an heiress to a fortune he could not buy. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Blackwood." David Martinez began, his voice calm and professional. "My client, Miss Kesha Johnson, is seeking an independent psychological reevaluation for your daughter Isabella. We have also filed a preliminary injunction with the Department of Children's Services based on what we believe is a clear case of child development neglect and emotional abuse." Richard scoffed, a practiced sound of contempt. "This is extortion. You people have no idea what you're talking about. My daughter has a diagnosed condition. She has been treated by the best specialists in the country." Dr. Chun leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Your daughter, Mr. Blackwood, is not the problem. Your expectations are, and your actions have systematically harmed her." Richard was about to launch into a furious rebuttal, but Martinez held up a hand. He pushed a small black device, a digital recorder, toward Richard. "My client has meticulously documented her time in your home, Mr. Blackwood. She has collected evidence not to be vindictive, but to prove a point. She believes that your daughter's silence is not a disability, but a symptom." He pressed a button, and the silence in the room was shattered by the sound of Isabella's voice. It was clear and articulate, a voice Richard had only heard for a few brief, fleeting moments. The recording was of her speaking to Kesha, a conversation filled with a vocabulary that was shockingly advanced for a 6-year-old. Isabella was talking about philosophy, about the works of a famous composer, about the frustration of living in a world that treated her as if she were a child with profound limitations. Richard's face paled. He had forgotten about the recorders. He had been so convinced that his power and his wealth were a shield against any threat. He had been so arrogant in his belief that he had destroyed all the evidence. But here it was, a living, breathing testament to his failings as a father. "These recordings were made without my permission." Richard stammered, his voice laced with a desperate fury. "They are illegal. They are an invasion of my privacy." Martinez shook his head gravely. "Actually, they're not. New York law allows for educational documentation when there is suspicion of child development neglect. And there's more. The next recording was even more devastating. It was Isabella's voice, clear and heartbreaking, explaining to Kesha, "Daddy always tells the doctors that I don't understand things. He talks about me as if I'm not there. Yesterday he said on the phone that I'm a non-returnable investment and that maybe he should send me to a special boarding school." Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. He vaguely remembered that phone call, a frustrating conversation with a business associate where he had spoken about his daughter in a cold, calculating manner as if she were a piece of property. He had always thought he was alone in his office, that no one was listening. He had been so wrong. There are 17 hours of similar material. Dr. Chun continued relentlessly, her voice a cold, surgical instrument of truth. Isabella consistently demonstrates superior intelligence, emotional stability when treated appropriately, and a painful understanding of how she is perceived by her father. She is not a broken child, Mr. Blackwood. She is a brilliant child who has learned to manipulate her world to get the attention she so desperately craves. But the worst was yet to come. The projector screen on the wall flickered to life, showing a series of medical reports from the last 3 years, all signed by Richard, all downplaying or distorting Isabella's actual abilities. Most disturbing, Dr. Chun said, is the correspondence we discovered between Mr. Blackwood and Isabella's therapists. Emails where he explicitly asks them to maintain diagnoses that justify her social disability, his exact words. Richard tried to stand to escape the torrent of evidence that was systematically destroying his life, but his lawyer, a man who had been silent up to this point, placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Sit down and listen. It's not over yet." Kesha Johnson entered the room. She was dressed in a simple professional suit, and she showed no anger or vindictive satisfaction. Just the quiet determination of someone who had meticulously documented an injustice. She carried a bulging folder in her hands, a final damning piece of evidence. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, her voice a low, steady current in the sea of his turmoil. "For 2 months, Isabella told me about how she pretended to have greater difficulties than she actually did. She realized that the more limited she seemed, the more attention she got from her father. A 6-year-old child manipulating adults to get basic affection." Richard finally exploded. The anger, the humiliation, the fear, it all boiled over in a furious, incoherent rage. "You manipulated my daughter. You taught her to lie to pretend she has abilities she doesn't have." Actually, Dr. Chun interrupted, her voice a sharp cutting sound. "The neurological tests we've done over the past few weeks confirm that Isabella has never had any cognitive limitations. The selective mutism was a response to systematic emotional neglect. Isabella didn't need to be cured, Mr. Blackwood. She needed to be seen." Kesha opened her folder, revealing hundreds of drawings, musical compositions, and even short poems that Isabella had created during those 2 months. They were not the creations of a child with a profound neurological disorder. They were the works of a prodigy, a brilliant mind that had been trapped in a world of silence. "But the doctors—" Richard stammered the words, a desperate, broken plea. "The doctors responded to your expectations," David Martinez explained coldly. "When an influential and wealthy parent repeatedly insists that their daughter has limitations, professionals tend to find evidence that confirms that narrative, especially when that parent pays very well for convenient diagnoses." The final blow came when Dr. Chun played the most recent recording made just 3 days earlier. It was Isabella conversing fluently with Margaret Foster, the nanny Richard had hired to replace Kesha, about philosophy and advanced mathematics. Isabella's voice, clear and articulate, echoed through the room. "What amazes me most is how Dad never realized that I always knew he was ashamed of me. I just pretended to be more limited because it seemed like the only way he would pay attention to me." Richard collapsed into his chair. All his arrogance, all his defiance evaporated in an instant. He felt a profound, overwhelming sense of shame. He looked at the woman he had so contemptuously dismissed, a woman who had given his daughter a voice. And he looked at his own reflection in the cold, polished table, a man who had spent his life building a kingdom of wealth and power, only to discover that he had lost the one thing that mattered most, the love and respect of his own daughter. I just wanted to protect her," he whispered the words, a raw, broken confession. "I wanted her to be normal, happy." "You wanted her to fit into your version of normal," Kesha corrected gently. "And when she didn't, you'd rather believe she was broken. then accept that maybe your definition of normal was too limited. David Martinez placed a document in front of Richard. The Department of Children's Services is considering a supervised joint custody plan. Isabella will continue to live with you, but with mandatory psychological counseling. Not for her, for you. Kesha looked at Richard, a flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't anger, but a tired, weary pity. I want you to be the father Isabella deserves, she said simply. I want you to see your daughter as the extraordinary child she has always been. And I want you to understand that some of the people you consider just employees may see treasures that you yourself have overlooked. Richard finally understood the full extent of his defeat. He had been defeated not by a lawyer or a judge, but by the simple truth of his own failings. The simple nanny he had despised was about to be celebrated nationally as the person who saved a gifted child from years of intellectual neglect. He looked at Kesha, a woman who had risked everything to help his daughter. He had tried to silence her, but in the end she had made the world listen. The world outside the law office was a blur of sound and motion, but for Richard Blackwood, it was all a distant, muffled echo. He walked through the city as if in a daze, the signed legal documents a heavy weight in his briefcase. The terms of the settlement were both a prison sentence and a lifeline. Supervised custody mandated psychological counseling and a new life for his daughter that would be guided by the very woman he had so contemptuously dismissed. The humiliation of it all was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He had lost. He had lost everything he thought he was fighting for, and in the process he had been exposed not as a man who had been lied to, but as a man who had lied to himself. He returned to the empty mansion, a place that now felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for his old life. He walked through the grand foyer, past the silent rooms and the expensive unopened toys, and he felt a profound, overwhelming sense of loss. He had built this life for Isabella, a fortress of wealth and privilege, and he had so blindly believed that this was all she needed. He had never once stopped to ask her what she wanted. He had never once stopped to simply listen. The first therapy session was the hardest thing Richard had ever done. He sat across from a new psychologist, a kind-faced man named Dr. Harris, who was nothing like the clinical business-like therapists he was used to. Dr. Harris did not speak in jargon or ask him to fill out forms. He simply sat and listened as Richard, a man who had never admitted a flaw in his life, began to talk. He spoke about his childhood, about a father who had been a cold, demanding perfectionist who had taught him that weakness was a crime. He spoke about his life, a relentless pursuit of success that had left no room for emotion or vulnerability. He spoke about Isabella, about his fear that she was broken, a living testament to his own failures. You didn't just want to protect her, Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Harris said gently. You wanted to protect yourself. Your daughter's silence was a convenient truth. It gave you an excuse to remain emotionally distant, to not have to deal with the messy, unpredictable reality of a child who was different. It allowed you to believe that she was the problem, not you. The words were a brutal, devastating truth. Richard had always believed he was a good man, a loving father. He had paid for the best doctors, the best therapists, the best of everything. He had convinced himself that his love was expressed through the lavish, opulent world he had created for his daughter. But in that moment, in that small, quiet office, he realized the truth. His love had been conditional. It had been dependent on Isabella being what he wanted her to be, not who she truly was. He had loved the idea of her, the perfect silent child, who would one day be a perfect silent woman, an accessory to his perfect successful life. The next few weeks were a painful, difficult journey. Richard continued with his therapy each session, a slow, agonizing process of dismantling a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. He began to see his world not as a monument to his success, but as a prison of his own making. He began to see his wealth not as a shield, but as a cage. He had built a life of unimaginable luxury, but he had lost the one thing that mattered most, his own humanity. He began to read the books Kesha had recommended, books on child psychology and emotional development, and he began to understand what she had so patiently tried to explain to him. He was a man who had built an empire on numbers and facts, but he was learning that the most important truths in life could not be found in a spreadsheet or a financial report. They could only be found in the human heart. He made his first tentative steps toward connecting with Isabella. He would go to her room not to demand a conversation, but to simply sit with her. He would bring her a book not to read to her but to read to himself, a quiet, unspoken offer of companionship. Isabella, for her part, remained cautious. Her silence was a fortress she had built to protect herself, and she was not ready to tear down the walls. She would watch him from across the room, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a quiet, heartbreaking hope. She had seen him so many times before, a man who had come to her with a promise and left her with a lie. She was waiting to see if this time was any different. One afternoon, Richard found Isabella in the nursery sitting at the portable keyboard, the one Keisha had brought. She was not playing, but simply running her small fingers over the keys, a silent, graceful dance. Richard sat down on the piano bench beside her a few feet away, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The silence was not the oppressive, accusatory silence he had grown to hate. It was a new silence, a silence of quiet understanding of two people who were trying to find a new language to speak to each other. I'm sorry, Isabella," he said, his voice a raw, unfamiliar sound. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm sorry I was afraid." Isabella stopped her silent dance. She did not look at him, but her body was no longer rigid with fear. She was listening. "I was afraid that if you weren't what the doctors said you were, then I was a failure as a father. I thought I could buy a solution. But Keisha, she showed me that the only solution was to listen." Isabella looked at him. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, were filled with tears. She reached out and with a small, trembling hand placed it on his. It was a gesture of an intimacy so profound, so unexpected, that it made Richard's heart ache. He had always seen her as a project, a problem to be solved. He was beginning to see her as a child who was capable of a forgiveness so pure, so unconditional, that it was a miracle. She reached for a notepad, the one she now carried with her everywhere, and wrote a single sentence. "I'm not broken, Daddy. I'm just waiting for you to see me." The words were a quiet, devastating truth, but they were also a promise. She was no longer a silent protest. She was a silent, hopeful, patient, waiting child. And for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood felt a profound sense of hope. He had lost his old life, but he was beginning to realize that he had a chance to build a new one. A life not of wealth and power, but of love and redemption. The journey had been difficult, but he was finally beginning to walk the path to becoming the father his daughter had always deserved. The revival of love did not come in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small, tentative steps. It was a painstaking process, a delicate rebuilding of a bridge that had been crumbling for years. For Richard Blackwood, who was accustomed to swift, decisive action, this new reality was a profound lesson in patience and humility. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth and power, but he was now learning to build a world of trust and intimacy, one quiet, vulnerable moment at a time. His days took on a new, unfamiliar rhythm. His morning ritual, once a blur of financial reports and market analyses, now began with a trip to Isabella's new school. It was not a sterile clinical setting like the therapy centers he had grown to hate, but a vibrant, chaotic world of gifted children, a place where geniuses ran around with their shoes untied and where laughter and music were as common as breathing. He would sit on a small bench in the back, a ghost in this world of unfettered joy, and watch his daughter. He would see her talking to other children, her voice clear and strong. He would see her at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as she played a complex Mozart sonata from memory. He would watch her, a small, vibrant creature, and he would feel a profound sense of awe. This was his daughter. The child he had believed was broken, a living testament to his own failures, was a brilliant, beautiful, and utterly extraordinary human being. He had once asked her a question and expected a silence. Now he would ask her a question, and he would wait, and she would answer. He would take her for walks in Central Park, a place he had only ever seen from the window of a limousine. He would not talk about business or school or her therapy. He would talk about the trees, the seasons, the way the light slanted through the leaves. He would simply be present. He would listen to her. He would listen to her talk about the birds, the butterflies, the stories she would make up about the people they would see. He was a man who had spent his life listening to numbers, but he was learning that the most beautiful melodies in the world were the simple, everyday words of his daughter. He had once tried to buy her happiness with toys and gifts. Now he would buy her happiness with moments. He would spend hours with her in the library, not in the grand, formal library of his home, but in a small, unassuming public library in her neighborhood. They would sit for hours side by side reading. He would read about history, about science, about the great men and women who had changed the world. She would read about magical creatures and faraway lands. They were two different worlds, but they were connected by a single, unwavering thread of companionship. His therapy sessions were no longer a chore, but a profound necessity. He began to talk about his own childhood, about a father who had taught him that vulnerability was a weakness and that love was a thing that had to be earned. He began to understand why he had treated Isabella as a project, a problem to be solved. He had been a child who had been taught that he was only valuable for his achievements, and he had so blindly, so tragically passed on that legacy to his own daughter. One night as he was putting Isabella to bed, she said something that made his heart stop. She said it so softly, so quietly, that he almost didn't hear it. "You're different now, Daddy." Richard sat on the edge of her bed, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean, sweetheart? You're not scared anymore," she whispered. "You used to be scared of me. Scared of what I might say. Scared of what I might not say. But you're not scared anymore." The words were a brutal, devastating truth, but they were also a gift. Isabella, who had been a quiet, patient observer of his life for so long, had seen the change in him. She had seen that he was no longer a man who was ruled by his fears. He was a man who was learning to be vulnerable. He was a man who was learning to be a father. He looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry, that he would do anything to go back in time and change the past. But he knew that words were no longer enough. He had to show her. He had to show her that his love for her was not conditional, that it was not dependent on her being what he wanted her to be, but that it was a simple, unconditional love for the extraordinary child she had always been. He reached out, and with a gentle, trembling hand, he stroked her hair. She leaned into his touch, her body relaxing into the warmth of his hand. It was a simple gesture, but for Richard, it was a moment of profound, breathtaking intimacy. He had spent his life building a world of unimaginable luxury, but he was beginning to realize that the greatest treasure in his life was the touch of his own daughter. He began to notice the small, subtle changes in her. The way she would leave a small drawing on his pillow in the morning. The way she would bring him a book that she had finished reading. The way she would, without warning, reach out and take his hand when they were walking in the park. These were not the actions of a child with a profound neurological disorder. These were the actions of a child who was beginning to heal, a child who was beginning to trust, a child who was beginning to love. The most difficult challenge was not the legal battle or the therapy sessions, but the process of forgiveness. He had to forgive himself for the years he had lost, for the love he had so tragically neglected, and he had to accept the forgiveness of his daughter, a forgiveness so pure, so unconditional that it was a miracle. He had a long way to go, but he was on his way. He was no longer a man who was defined by his past, but a man who was building a new future. A future not of wealth and power, but of love and redemption. And he was doing it one small, tentative step at a time, with the hand of his daughter in his. 6 months had passed, and the world of Richard Blackwood had been reborn. The cold marble of his penthouse no longer felt like a mausoleum, but a home. The silence was no longer oppressive, but a comfortable canvas upon which 1,000 small, beautiful sounds were now painted: the soft sound of a piano, the rustle of a turning page, the gentle murmur of a child's laughter. The man who had once believed that everything had a price was now learning that the most valuable things in life were free. He was no longer a man defined by his past, but a man who was building a new future one day at a time with the hand of his daughter in his. Today was a day of profound significance. Richard sat in the front row of the Columbia University auditorium, a place where he had once come to be publicly humiliated, and now he came to bear witness to a miracle. The air was filled with the murmur of proud parents, the flash of cameras, and the quiet dignity of a place dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. He was not here as a titan of industry, but as a father. A humble, grateful, and deeply changed man. Isabella, now 7 years old, walked onto the stage. She was not the small, timid creature who had once cowered behind Keisha's dress. She was a poised, confident young woman, her back straight, her head held high. She wore a simple, elegant white dress, and her eyes, the color of a summer sky, shone with a brilliant, undeniable light. She was here to receive a Medal of Honor for academic excellence, a rare honor for a child her age. The list of her accomplishments read aloud by the dean was staggering. She was now fluent in 5 languages and the composer of 3 original musical pieces. Her artwork had been featured in a university exhibition, and she was a research associate on a groundbreaking study on child development. Richard felt tears stream down his face, a raw, honest emotion he had once been so ashamed to show. He thought of the little girl he had seen singing with Kesha, the girl he had so blindly believed was broken. He had lost his old life, but he had found something so much more valuable. He had found his daughter. Isabella gave her speech with a confidence that was breathtaking. She spoke about the power of music, about the beauty of mathematics, and about the courage it took to find her voice. She did not mention her father by name, but she spoke of the importance of being seen, of being heard, and of the transformative power of a single person who chose to listen. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in a wave of applause. The dean presented her with her medal, a small, shining symbol of her genius. She walked off the stage a hero in her own right, and she came directly to him. She did not go to her friends or her teachers or her mentors. She came to him. "Daddy," she whispered, as she stepped off the stage, her voice a small, intimate sound only he could hear. "Are you proud of me now?" Richard hugged his daughter, the medal, a cold metal disc between them, and he held her for a long moment, the warmth of her body a living testament to his own redemption. "I've always been proud of you, Princess," he said, his voice a raw, choked whisper. "I just had to learn to see it." From the audience, a woman watched him, a faint, sad smile on her face. Kesha Johnson. She was sitting with her mentor, Dr. Sarah Chun. She was no longer just a nanny. She was a nationally recognized doctoral candidate, a child development consultant, and a woman who was about to publish her first book, Invisible Children: How Prejudice Kills Potential. She had not come for a public display of revenge. She had come to bear witness to the fruit of her labor. She had not only saved a child, she had saved a family. Richard approached her after the ceremony. He was no longer a man who saw her as a servant. He saw her as an equal, a woman who had taught him the most important lesson of his life. "Kesha," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, humble sincerity. I'm sorry for everything." Kesha looked at him, and she saw the profound, permanent change in his eyes. She saw a man who had been broken and had been rebuilt by the love of his own daughter. "You don't need to apologize, Mr. Blackwood," she interrupted gently. "You need to keep being the father Isabella always knew you could be." Margaret Foster, who had become a key ally in the family's transformation, watched from the audience as Isabella ran through the auditorium with other gifted children, her laughter a joyous sound in the air. Margaret, a woman who had once believed in the unshakable truth of professional decorum, had learned that sometimes the greatest professional act was a simple act of human kindness. She had been hired to care for a child, but she had helped to save her. Kesha's true revenge was not to destroy Richard Blackwood, but to transform him into the father Isabella deserved. She had proven that sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating our enemies, but saving them from themselves. She had shown that the greatest treasures in the world are not found in wealth or power, but in a child's quiet, hidden potential. And so we come to the end of our story, a tale of change, love, and courage. The journey of Isabella and Richard teaches us that prejudice can blind us to our most precious treasures, and that truth is sometimes hidden behind the facade we ourselves create. Every child is a gift, and the most important thing is not to fix them, but to learn to see them for who they truly are. If you believe that every child deserves to be seen for their true potential, and not what others expect of them, please show your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. Because when we stop judging by appearances and start truly listening, we discover that the greatest treasures are often hidden right under our own noses.